remembered, and the light that they still shine for us in Rotary from the firmament up above. I dedicate my remarks to the Rotarians of today, especially our brothers and sisters in Nepal, as they respond to the terrible earthquake there. And I dedicate my remarks to the future of Rotary, so well represented by those members of Rotary here this morning. God bless you. Oh, well, how it's done my heart good to be with you here this weekend, where so many of you have recognized me. It does an old politician's heart good. You said hello, Teddy. And good evening, Mr. President. Some even knew that in my retirement I preferred to be called by my old military title, Colonel, for my brief time in the Spanish-American War. But all of those greetings, historically accurate, stand in such stark contrast to my recent visit to Theodore Roosevelt High School in Los Angeles, California. The students there are the Rough Riders, and my pictures and quotations adorn each and every hallway and classroom. But when I arrived there, so attired and with my top hat, one young man spotted me, pointed at me, and told his friends, he said, "Look, there's the Monopoly dude." Very humbling. Of course, if they knew their history as well as you, they would have known I was the anti-Monopoly dude. Great trustbuster. Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to be here especially at the invitation of your district governor, Mr. David Del Monte. There's no finer district governor across the world, Rotary International. I salute the work that he does, and I'm especially grateful for the fact that he not only invited me to come and sing for my supper at a program at the Harvard Club. I've heard you've changed your loyalties to the Princeton Club now. As an old Crimson man, I'm a little disappointed, but I look forward to my next visit in any case. When I spoke to the Rotary Club, Mr. Del Monte made it certain that indeed he understood that service above self, and especially serving our young people, is a great call in Rotary. And so he allowed me to visit with thousands of school children in New York at DeWitt Clinton High School, at Frederick Douglass Academy, at Brother Rice, at the New York City High School for Science, Engineering, and Math, and also at wonderful Guadalupe Luperon High School. Well, the children were wonderful, and I look forward to my next visit to New York City. You may know I am the only president born in New York City, New York. Though my life is associated with the great outdoors, the western states, the national parks, the national forests, and with the strenuous life that I lived and preached. Now, when I was a young boy growing up nearby Gramercy Park, the home at 28 East 20th Street, far from living the strenuous life, I was a very weak and sickly child. I had asthma. And any of you who has asthma or has asthma amongst your family or friends, you know what a terrible disease that is. To see a small child choking for breath and for life itself. Today, thankfully, the asthmatic child has the inhaler to restore breath, hopefully, quickly. In my day, we had no such medicine. In my day, the treatment for asthma was worse than the disease. Can you imagine giving a small asthmatic boy a cigar to smoke? The idea was coffee would stimulate my breathing. I was given bitter black coffee to drink, again, as a stimulant. And I was given Ipecac syrup to drink. Oh, I hear from your groans and see by your grimaces. You're of a generation, you know Ipecac syrup. The Rotaract young people probably know it not. Ipecac syrup is something that you drink in order to see your lunch. Unpleasant memories for me to this very day. When I was a young boy of 11, my father, Theodore Roosevelt, the man for whom I'm named, and the greatest man I ever knew, he called me into his study for a heart-to-heart talk. I knew the seriousness of the subject to follow, for rather than calling me by the diminutive nickname by which I was known in the family, Teeny, he said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. Without the aid of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it otherwise should. It is hard work and drudgery, but you must make your body." I said, "Father, I shall." And I set out to make my body with calisthenics. I lifted weights, I swam, I rowed, I worked on the parallel bars and on the rings. I even took boxing lessons in the classical manner. And I built my body. And it does appear I may have overdone it just a bit. Well, now, as we stand here today, of course, you know that Rotary was founded during my administration in 1905 in Chicago. There was a great deal about the country then. Other organizations of social good and welfare founded then. 4-H, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America in that same first decade of the 20th century. It speaks to the spirit of the American people. We've become a wealthy nation. But wealth in and of itself is not the measure of a civilization. It's what you do with that wealth, how you reach down to serve others. Hence my speech in Chicago in 1899 when I said, I come not to preach the life of ignoble ease. I come to preach the strenuous life. Those of you privileged to have college educations, to have an opportunity to work in gainful employment, your first responsibility, of course, is to provide for your family. But once the needs of the family are met, one must look about oneself to the community and see that the needs of the community are met. What a fine Rotarian my father, Theodore Roosevelt, would have made. He was a founding member of the New York Society for Children in Society, a founding member of the New York Orthopedic Hospital. And he took the children by turn. On Sunday afternoons, he would take us where he taught Sunday school at the Newspaper Boys Lodging House. The Bible lessons he taught us children are near and dear to my heart. My favorite passage from the Old Testament, from the book of Micah. What does the Lord require of thee? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the Lord. You know, of course, in 1901, when I took the oath of office under emergency circumstances in Buffalo, New York, President McKinley sadly being killed in that city, I did so in a private residence in a borrowed suit of clothes, without a Bible at hand. Elected in my own right in 1904, then in 1905 being inaugurated, I wore my own suit. I had the family Bible at hand. On my right hand, held aloft, I had a ring given to me that morning by Secretary of State John Hay, he who in his youth had been private secretary to Abraham Lincoln. That was a locket ring. In the locket was a clipping of Abraham Lincoln's hair. I held that hand aloft, and my left hand was upon James 1:22. Be thou not only hearers of the word, but doers of the word also. You, Rotarians, belong to the fellowship of the doers. Words not backed up by deeds are empty. You do the work of the gospel. You do the good deeds for the widow and the orphan, those that are hungry and destitute, and those like those who suffer in Nepal now, who suffer from tragedy. Rotarians are certainly on the front line there, as they have been each and every time that the people of the world have suffered. Well, indeed, now, as a student of history, I know that Mr. Del Monte especially is fond of history. In many of the Rotary clubs that I visit, there's a little something in the newsletter sometimes by the fine master, this date in history. We're here in late April, as was General George Washington and his troops in Valley Forge. I think in part the reason for meeting in Valley Forge is to be inspired by those founders of our country who suffered here. I've met some of the young men here in the Rotary Club from Germany. You know the story of Valley Forge is also a story of a German hero of the American Revolution, Baron Friedrich von Steuben. He trained the American soldiers, ragtag volunteers and farmers. They lacked any discipline in the field, but for the training that they then received from Baron von Steuben, who is buried in New York State, in the woods outside of Utica. While you're in the United States, I recommend that you take a road trip and go visit the gravesite of von Steuben. Now, in April, these days, the 25th and 26th, when I was a little boy in 1865, I witnessed the sad funeral parade of President Lincoln as it came through New York City. You may know a famous photograph was taken of the parade as it passed by my grandfather's house at Union Square. Decades later, a historian noticed that if you looked at the photograph, there were, in my grandfather's house in a second-floor window, the silhouettes of two small boys watching the parade below. That's me and my brother Elliot, Eleanor Roosevelt's father, watching the parade below. What you do not see is that my future bride, Edith Carroll, is locked in the closet. She had been crying at the sight of the wounded Union soldiers in the parade. It was annoying me greatly. I locked her in the closet. A sin for which she apparently forgave me in the intervening years. It was on this date, in 1895, that I became president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. I fought against vice and corruption in New York City. How's that going, by the way? I was famous as president of the police commission for walking through New York in the middle of the night, through the boroughs and the precincts, wherever there was a policeman derelict of duty, sleeping on a park bench, or worse yet, sitting on a tavern stool. The next morning, at 8 o'clock in the morning, that officer was up on charges before the police board. I fought against the major source of corruption during my time. It was the lack of enforcement of the Sunday Blue Law. Albany, the state government, had passed a law stating that the taverns in New York City should remain closed on Sunday, that there should be no sale of brewed or distilled spirits. The law was not enforced. The side doors and alley doors of the taverns remained open. Of course, New York City then, being a city full of men of Italian and German and Irish descent, those men working 6 days a week, they thought it the providential right to drink in public on the 7th. But the tavern owners were paying bribes to the police officers to look the other way. And if you do not enforce each and every law of the Republic, you pull away the confidence of the people in the system of law and order. I saw the taverns closed on Sundays. And the New York Times reported it was the driest summer in New York City history. Of course, the tavern owners were a very powerful group politically, and they lobbied Albany to change the law, such that any tavern that had on its premises 10 or more beds would be considered an inn and would be exempt from the law. I can only tell you that the addition of beds to the taverns had certain unintended consequences. Well, it was on this date as well that I became a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. The Rough Riders is how we are known as history, and how I rose like a rocket after having the luck to get into the war, to fight in the war, and to get out of the war again. When we were quarantined that fall of 1898 at Montauk Point, out at Camp Wyckoff on the eastern point of Long Island, the Republican bosses sent an emissary to see if I would be willing to be a candidate for the governorship that fall. The Republican incumbent mired in controversy and malfeasance. I agreed to be the candidate. Can you imagine when my campaign train rolled up into upstate New York villages, out from the cattle car would pour Rough Riders, in uniform, on horseback, shooting their weapons and blowing a bugle. And in one upstate New York village, one Rough Rider sergeant introduced me to the audience thusly. He said, in Cuba, Colonel Roosevelt led us like sheep to slaughter. And if you elect him governor, he will so lead you. Despite the implications of the endorsement, I was elected governor. Began to deliver what I called a square deal for the people of New York, fighting against corruption, eliminating bribery amongst the game wardens, and seeking the taxation of certain public monopolies in New York City, like the elevated train and the gas company, they previously paying no royalties to the state government, from which they benefited greatly by their monopoly. Well, that was too much square dealing for the bosses of New York. They decided to send me away to a place from which a man might never be heard from again. The Vice Presidency of the United States. I was unanimously nominated in 1900 to join the re-election ticket of President McKinley, Vice President Hobart of New Jersey, having died in office. I say unanimously, every vote but one, my own. I said I would rather be a history professor than be vice president. But once nominated, felt it my duty to serve. And I hope there's something of the legacy of the Roosevelt administration that you might still appreciate. 230 million acres of national parks, national forests, wildlife refuges, bird sanctuaries, and national monuments declared or legislated during the Roosevelt administration. The digging of the Panama Canal, that which had been a vision of mankind since the time of Balboa in the early 17th century, became a reality because of American engineering and know-how and medicine, the elimination of yellow fever from the canal zone. Oh, the square deal, the trust busting, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the federal railroad rate regulation, and so much more. So much dust in the streets of history. There were some wonderful occurrences during my administration. I mentioned the founding of Rotary, perhaps in part because so many of us were preaching about the duties of citizenship, the responsibility to, in the words of the Boy Scouts, leave our campground cleaner than you found it. Hearing this sort of call and having the light of Rotary in his original heart, Paul Harris and the other members of Chicago founded that first Chicago Rotary Club. The name of the club deriving from the fact that luncheon was rotated from one man's office to another on a weekly basis. Now, of course, you know your Rotary history. The first public service project of the Chicago Rotary Club was, now, it's the second one I think you're thinking of, my friend. The first was to purchase a horse for an itinerant preacher whose horse had died. But you're right, sir, the second public service project, the more famous one, was to build the first public toilets in Chicago. And Rotarians have been bringing relief to the people of the world ever since. I mentioned this date in history. It was on this date that we celebrated in 1907 the tricentennial of the founding of Jamestown, that early English settlement in Virginia. Of course, I went and spoke. It was a time when we were celebrating the wonderful relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, what became known as the special relationship. Our guest during that great festival, my friend, King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. A sailing race was held in conjunction there. That sailing race eventually became a wonderful tradition that today in Bermuda is remembered as the King Edward VII, the Gold Cup sailing race in Bermuda. First won by an American, I might say, off the coast of Virginia. What a wonderful historic relationship we have between the United States, between especially New York and Bermuda. And so I celebrate as well those Bermudan delegates that are here today. When I was a little boy, though I was a New Yorker, and my father a New Yorker, like 5 generations of Roosevelts before, I wonder if you realize that my mother and her kin were the Bullocks of Roswell, Georgia. I had not only my mother at the home, but my grandmother Bullock and my Aunt Hannah Bullock lived with us in Manhattan. So when that terrible Civil War came about, there was great consternation in the Roosevelt household. My father served the Union cause not as a soldier, but as a sanitary commissioner and as an allotment commissioner. During the war years, he traveled in the north, the south, and the west, and wherever there were troops from New York, he was signing them up that they might send a portion of their pay home for the support of spouse and children. It was the beginning of the allotment for members of the service. Now, when my father was away from home, our home, nearby Gramercy Park, became a bevy of pro-Confederate activity. For my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt would have us children in the basement, in the kitchen, preparing packages of money, medicine, bandages, clothing. Those packages would make their way to the wharf, and then via Bermuda, they would be smuggled through the blockade to bring home, to bring aid to family and friends back in my mother's home of Georgia. So while I never myself visited Bermuda, I do know that my uncles, the brothers Bullock, heroes of the Confederate Navy, visited Bermuda as they captained some of the ships of the Confederate Navy. Well, as I said, so much history in my presidency, and some of it I hope that you still remember. But I must admit, I probably am best remembered for the legacy of a failure, a failed bear hunt in Onward, Mississippi in 1902. My friends and I had been 3 days in the cane brakes of the Mississippi River Delta, and we had not even seen a bear. in great part for the fact that my friends from Louisiana and Mississippi attempted to outdo one another with regards to the expression of Southern hospitality. Those of you who are sportsmen or sportswomen understand, you can either have a great hunt or a great picnic. You generally cannot have them both at the same time in the same place. I'm sure we scared every bear out of the Delta. But on the third night, the famous hunting guide Hope Collier came into camp. He said, "Mr. President, I shall have you a bear by morning if I need to bring it into camp on the end of a rope." We all laughed. The next morning, men were yelling, dogs were barking. I raced out from my tent, and there indeed, Mr. Collier had tethered an old wounded male bear to a tree. The bear was greatly wounded on its chest. Hunting dogs had attacked the bear. The bear killed two of the hunting dogs. Mr. Collier wanted to save his prize hunting dogs, but fearing to fire his rifle for fear of harming the dogs, he went into the shallow water in which the bear and the dogs were wrestling, and he broke the barrel of his gun across the bear's head. The bear was bleeding from a great gash and wound on its head. When the bear was dazed by the blow, Mr. Collier tied one end of his lariat around the bear's neck, dove and tied the other end to a tree. And this horrific scene was the scene upon which I came, rushing from my tent. My horror compounded when one in my hunting party said, "Mr. President, there's your bear. Go ahead and shoot your bear." What a cowardly thing that would have been to do. I refused to shoot that bear. I had founded Boone and Crockett, the nation's first fair hunting and conservation organization, a decade and a half before. When I refused to shoot that bear, the story spread throughout the country. The cartoonist Clifford Berryman, hearing that story, drew a cartoon of the incident, called it "Drawing the Line in Mississippi." The cartoon showed me refusing to shoot a small bear cub tied to a tree. When I returned to the White House, I received a letter from the Mictum family. They eventually, the Ideal Toy Company of New York City, New York. Mrs. Mictum, in her letter to me, asking permission to make a stuffed bear and to name it after me. I wrote back, I said, "You may go ahead and do so, but I don't think it will help your sales very much at all." I wonder if any of you have known the love and comfort of what then was called Teddy's bear. Do any of you still have your teddy bear? Wonderful. I see some of you ladies have married your teddy bear. And now, if I may, it would be a great honor for me, if I may, with the district governor's permission, to present our honored representative from Rotary International President and your dear wife with this teddy bear, if I may. It was also in April of 1910. I was touring Europe after my son Kermit and I had hunted in Africa after my presidency. I accepted my Nobel Peace Prize, given to me and the American people for settling the Russo-Japanese War. I marched in the funeral of King Edward VII, and I spoke at the great universities, including in April 1910 at the Sorbonne, the University of Paris. I made a speech there, which is amongst the most famous of my utterances. You are relieved to know I shall not recite the speech in its entirety. It's called Citizenship in a Republic. Some of you may wish to read the speech later. It's a small portion of that speech which does remain famous to this day. It delights me to know that these words today are stenciled below decks on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. The Navy calls that nuclear aircraft carrier the Big Stick, as in the old African proverb I was wont to quote and that you heard quoted earlier today. Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far. I'm told that these words were used by Coach Harbaugh of the Ravens when he rallied that team to the Super Bowl championship. I'm even told that a small portion of these words are tattooed somewhere on young Miley Cyrus. Not quite sure what to think about that. Maybe she does have a mind for history. But I share these words with you, good Rotarians, for I know that so many of you are doing the good deeds. And of course, this is America or Bermuda. No good deed goes unpunished. Certainly no good deed goes without its second guessing, its Monday morning quarterbacking, its criticism. Persist in your good deeds. Humanity needs them now more than ever. And when you are criticized, take heart from the words that I shared with the French a century ago, with you here at Valley Forge this morning, remember, it is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man, and today to the woman, who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, that his name shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Good Rotarians, we've all known victory, we've all known defeat. We're all human, we all prefer the former over the latter. But I've shared some stories with you in brief, and do so with children throughout the country to give them encouragement. Why, what if when I was a little boy I allowed myself to think of myself and define myself as a weak and sickly invalid, instead famously living the strenuous life? Oh, I did not share with you the tragedy of my youth when I was a young man of 25 and a member of the New York General Assembly. My wife and mother died on the same day of two different diseases. My mother in the morning of typhoid fever, and my young bride of Bright's disease, a kidney disease not quite treatable by modern medicine. If you know my story, you know I then went to the Dakota Territory. And through hard work and ranching, horse riding and hunting, eventually even my great sadness healed. But what if as a young man I'd allowed my life to be defined by that terrible twin tragedy that befell me that St. Valentine's Day in New York City? Instead healing and getting back in the family way, 17 grandchildren. Why, even in politics, as a young man, I ran for the mayorship of New York. I came in third. Out of 3. That's last place. What if I'd given up on politics and public service after such a humiliating defeat in my home city? I would have never been your president, fighting for the square deal. The reason, by the way, that the artist got involved and says I'm atop Mount Rushmore with the others. No, indeed, in each and every one of our lives there will be tragedy and hardship and defeat. Life will knock you down. Your duty to yourself, to your community, your duty to Rotary International is that when life does knock you down, you're to get back up, dust yourself off, and get back into the fight for life. Now, you may say, as one senator said coming to the White House, Mr. President, you're preaching. I said, Senator, you're right. And the presidency is a bully pulpit, too. Well, each and every one of you, in your Rotary clubs, in Seoul, in Incheon, in Hamilton, in St. George, in Yonkers, in White Plains, in Staten Island, you have a bully pulpit from which to preach, and a community in which to do the great works of Rotary that light up the world with the light of Rotary. God bless and Godspeed each and every one of you in the works that you do for Rotary. And I wish you all the best in your good deeds in your communities in the year ahead. And congratulations on your district conference, of which I'm delighted to be just a small part this morning. Thank you so very, very much. It was October of 1912 during the Bold Moose Progressive campaign for the presidency. I left the Hotel Gilpatrick. I was going to go and make a speech to thousands of citizens waiting at the auditorium. I left the hotel, ascended an open-air automobile, turned and waved to the crowd outside the hotel. When I did so, a madman reached into the automobile and shot me at close range with a .38 caliber. The bullet pierced my overcoat, my folded speech, and my steel eyeglass case, knocked me down in the automobile in which I was riding. I first stood and made sure that no vigilante justice was done to the man that shot me. But then, being a hunter and a former soldier, I knew to spit into my palm and to check my spittle. There was no blood in my spittle. My lung was not punctured. It was but a mere flesh wound. I refused medical attention. I demanded to go and make my speech. The automobile took me thither. I climbed upon the stage. I pulled my jacket to the side. I showed the audience my bloody blouse. I said, you must bear with me. You may not understand.